Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on rare Chinese improvised tanks and armored cars of the Post-Qing era, the Chinese Civil War, and the Second Sino-Japanese War of 1937 through 1945. Now, after the overthrow of the Qing government during the various Chinese revolutions of 1911 through 1916, the Chinese military actually experimented with a variety of different improvised tanks, armored cars, and some modifications of foreign tanks. So let's go over some of the rarer tanks that were used by the various Chinese factions and warlords during the Post-Qing era and during the Second World War. And the first tank on the list is the Songso tank from 1918 through 1920. Now, this was actually an experimental medium heavy tank that was actually a copy of an American tank. Now, in 1918, an American company called the Studebaker Company actually produced a prototype medium heavy tank for the U.S. Army, but this prototype was later rejected, and the owners of the Studebaker Company later went to China, where they constructed another version of the same vehicle, this time fitted with two turrets. And this version was known as the Songso tank, and was actually used by a Chinese warlord by the name of Songso during the post-revolutionary era. This vehicle was armed with four 7.92mm either Browning or Maxim machine guns. Two of these machine guns were fitted into two turrets on top of the vehicle. The vehicle had an armor thickness of between 5 and 10 millimeters. Its speed was 6 to 10 miles per hour, and it had a crew of between 4 and 5. Now, the Songso tank is stated to have been used during the First Chinese Civil War, but this vehicle was designed just before the First Chinese Civil War, which began in 1924. The next vehicle on the list is the Chongqing armored car from 1926, and this was actually a heavy armored truck produced for the Chinese Nationalist Army, or the Kuomintang, during the First Chinese Civil War of 1924 through 1928. This vehicle had an armament of either one or two 7.62 or 7.7mm Vickers machine guns or Maxim machine guns. Its armor thickness was also 5 to 10 millimeters, and its speed was relatively unknown. Now, I could only find one image of this vehicle, so I'm assuming that only one of these armored cars or armored trucks were actually produced, but it could have been as many as 10. So I would say that at least 10 of these vehicles were produced, and they were used during the middle of the Chinese Civil War, also known as the warlord period in China between 1924 and 1928. The next armored fighting vehicle, or improvised armored fighting vehicle from the First Chinese Civil War, is the Tang armored car from 1928. This was an improvised 4x2 armored car that was used by the Feng Tian clique in the First Chinese Civil War. Now, the Feng Tian clique was actually one of the opposing forces facing the nationalist Kuomintang army in the Civil War, along with the Communist Party and a few other warlords. In this vehicle, the Chang armored car had a main armament of two 7.62 or two 7.7mm machine guns. Its armor thickness was 8 to 10 millimeters, but its speed was unknown. And these vehicles were produced for the Feng Tian clique in the Civil War. Now, ultimately, in the year 1928 through 1930, the Feng Tian clique was ultimately defeated by the Chinese Nationalist Army under Chiang Kai-shek, who later defeated the other warlords also. And he pretty much reunited most of China, with the exceptions of the tiny portions of China that were still under Japanese occupation or were still in the hands of the communist forces. The next series of armored car actually comes from the British forces in Shanghai. Now, between 1925 and the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, both Britain and France and the United States actually patrolled the neutral city of Shanghai. And during this time period, the British RollsRoyce company actually produced a rare offshoot of their Rolls-Royce armored car from World War I. And these vehicles were specifically designed for the Shanghai military military police, and they were armed with one 7mm Vickers machine gun. Their armor thickness was 6 to 10 millimeters, and they had a speed of about 18 to 25 miles per hour. And they were used by both British and the Chinese nationalist police in the city of Shanghai. Later on, in 1938, Shanghai was invaded by the Imperial Japanese Army, and many of these armored cars were used in combat with the Japanese forces, and some of these retreated with the British Army and the Chinese Nationalist Army, and they were still being used during the Second Sino-Japanese War, but it is unknown if any of these vehicles ever survived that conflict. Next series of armored cars actually comes from the Ford Motor Company. And later on, in the 1930s, the Chinese forces began purchasing Ford trucks to be converted into 4x2 armored cars. And these were simply known as the KMT Fordson armored cars. And they were also fitted with one or two 7.62mm machine guns. Their armor thickness was between 8 and 9 millimeters, but their speed is largely unknown. Not many of these Chinese Ford armored cars were produced, but at least 20 to 30 of these vehicles were produced during the era before the Japanese invasion of 1937. And they came in two varieties. There was a turretless version of the Tang Ford armored car, and there was also a turreted version of the Tang Ford armored car. The turreted version had a 7.7mm machine gun and a rotating turret, but these vehicles were ultimately rare, and they were also used during the Japanese invasion of China in 1937. Another strange armored car actually comes from France, and this is the French Shanghai armored car, which was also designed around the same time as the British Shanghai armored car series by Rolls-Royce. Now, these vehicles were armed with one 8mm Hotchkiss machine gun. Their armor thickness was between 6 and 15 millimeters, and their speed was largely unknown. Not many of these vehicles were built, no more than 5 or 10 of these were constructed, and they were used by French military police and the French-backed Kuomintang nationalist army police in the city of Shanghai between the 1930s and the time where Japan invaded the city of Shanghai around 1937 through 1938 during the Second Sino-Japanese War. The next strange Chinese vehicle on the list is actually one of my favorite tanks to be used by the Chinese nationalist forces, and this is actually a French-designed vehicle known as the Renault ZB. Now, the Renault ZB was actually a redesign of the French AMR-33 light tank, except this vehicle was designed to be exported to China. Now, the difference between these vehicles, between the Renault ZB and the Renault AMR-35, is that the ZB is actually slightly longer and has thicker armor and has 2 grades of armor. This main armament is also different than the French version. Now, the main armament of this Renault ZB was the main armament of these vehicles were one 13.2mm Hotchkiss M1929 anti-tank machine gun. Some of these were also fitted with one 37mm Putex SA-18 infantry tank gun. These vehicles had an armor thickness of between 9 and 13 millimeters, and their speed was 65 kilometers per hour or 50 miles per hour. Now, these vehicles were originally built between 1935 and 1936, and they were delivered to the Chinese Nationalist Army in 1940, just before the fall of France. Now, these vehicles were actually used by the Yan'an clique, which was an independent army that operated along with the Kuomintang forces during the Japanese invasion of Burma in 1941 through 1945. And during this time period, 19 of these vehicles were constructed for the Chinese Nationalist Army just before France itself was defeated by Germany during the Battle of France in early to mid 1940. So one of these stranger Renault tanks to be used in China. The 13.2mm machine gun was actually strong enough to punch through the armor of most Japanese light tanks, and the 37mm Putex gun was a good enough infantry support gun at that time, until the Japanese started using heavier infantry support guns on their vehicles. Next armored fighting vehicle, or rare armored fighting vehicle to be used by China, is actually a rare improvised heavy armored car, and that is the Kusaka armored car, car, which was designed sometime between 1938 and 1939. Now, this vehicle was actually based off an Austrian vehicle. The Austrian Steyr ADGZ armored cars, which were designed in the early 1930s. Now, you may remember that vehicle for its use during the Battle of Dzang in 1939, during the German invasion of Poland and the free city of Danzig. Somehow, the Chinese Kuomintang got blueprints of that vehicle and decided to produce their own copies, and these were known as the Kusaka cars. But only one photograph of these vehicles exists. This vehicle exists, and it was actually taken by Japanese troops during a failed Chinese counterattack in 1939. These vehicles were armed with two 7.92mm German-made MG-34 machine guns. Their armor thickness was somewhere between 6 and 10, and some sources say upwards to 15mm. Their speed was largely unknown, but they were used by the Kuomintang Nationalist Army. Only about 1 to 5 of these vehicles were produced, and only one photograph survives of the Kusaka car. So this is actually one of the rarer armored fighting vehicles to be used in China. And remember, this is actually a Chinese copy or imitation of the Austrian Steyr ADGZ heavy armored car from the early 1930s. The next improvised infantry fighting vehicle actually comes from the Chinese Communist forces led by Mao Zedong. This one photograph is all I have of this vehicle, and it seems to be a Maoist copy of the Soviet Su-76, except this vehicle looks a bit janky. It looks like it was converted from an existing tank or artillery tractor. But this vehicle was constructed sometime between 1944 and 1945, towards the end of the war in China. It was armed with one 76.2mm field gun or anti-tank gun. Its armor thickness is at least 10 to 30mm, and it had a speed of roughly 20 to 25 miles per hour. Now, this vehicle was seen at a Chinese Communist arms exposition in northern China in 1944 and 1945. So it is unknown if this vehicle was actually used in combat during the Second World War in China. But it is a strange Maoist copy of the Soviet Su-76. And the next improvised armored fighting vehicles actually comes from both the nationalist and communist forces in China towards the very end of the war in 1945, and that is the Chinese LVT-A4, and these were improvised tank destroyers designed in 1945. These were actually constructed from American LVTs, or landing vehicle tank, amphibious tank landing craft supplied to the Kuomintang forces during the war against Japan. Now, many of these were actually captured by the Chinese communists during the war. They were later modified with improvised turrets fitted with either a 57mm Russian-made ZIS-2 anti-tank gun or a 76mm ZIS-3 anti-tank gun. Their armor thickness was between 6 and 13mm, and they had a speed of roughly 20 miles per hour. Now, after World War II, during the Chinese Civil War, many of these redesigned LVTs were used against the Kuomintang forces, and during the course of the second phase of the Chinese Civil War between 1946 and 1950, the Chinese communists captured more and more of these LVTs, converting them into what they call the LVT-A4, and these were later, all of these were later regunned with the 57 or 76mm Soviet-made anti-tank gun and deployed against Chinese communist forces. I believe some of these were also used during the early stages of the Korean War in 1950 through 1951. Another strange vehicle designed by the Kuomintang towards the end of the war in China was the KMT Angel Tong armored car from 1945, and this was another series of armored cars produced for the Chinese Kuomintang, and these were also armed with the 7mm Type 91 machine guns, which were actually captured from Japanese forces during the war. Now, later on, on, during the Civil War, these were used by Kuomintang forces as reconnaissance armored cars against the Chinese Red Army forces during the Chinese Civil War, or the Second Civil War of 1946 through 1950. Now, many of these vehicles were either destroyed or later captured by the Communist forces, and they were most likely scrapped after the Civil War period around 1950. Another strange vehicle designed by the Chinese nationalists was the Shanghai GMC Heavy improvised armored car from 1948, and these were designed towards the end of the Civil War during the last 2 years of the Chinese Civil War, the Second Civil War of 1946 to 1950, and these were fitted with either two 8mm Maxim or two 20mm Oerlikon machine guns. Their armor thickness was between 6 and 20 millimeters, but their speed was unknown, and they were actually constructed using American-made GMC heavy flatbed trucks that were converted into heavy improvised armored cars. And these were used by the Kuomintang forces, and some of these were also captured by the Chinese Communists during the Second Civil War, making them some of the rarer vehicles. And these vehicles were originally designed to defend the city of Shanghai from Communist forces towards the last 2 years of the Chinese Civil War. Another strange vehicle is actually a modification of a Japanese vehicle, and this is the Chinese Type 97 Chihar, and these were just old Type 97 tanks refitted with a larger 75mm gun, turning them into self-propelled tank guns or self-propelled guns instead of their original role as light medium tanks or medium light tanks, as they were designed to be used by the Japanese army. And these vehicles were used by both the Communist and Kuomintang forces later on during the Civil War era, the Second Civil War era of 1946 to 1950. And the final vehicle on the list is actually the most interesting, and that is the Kuomintang GMC M10 tank destroyers. Now, these were old American M10 tank destroyers that were redesigned by the Chinese nationalists during the end of World War II and later used during the Second Civil War of 1946 to 1950. And these vehicles were heavily modified M10 tank destroyers. They were later fitted with larger 105mm Type 91 field guns that were captured from Japanese forces during the war. Their armor thickness was between 6 and 13 millimeters, and they had a speed of about 20 miles per hour. But these vehicles were much more powerful than the standard M10s, and they were also used as heavy infantry support tanks by the Chinese Kuomintang forces or nationalist forces during the Second Civil War era. So what do you think of all of these improvised tanks and armored cars? Which are your favorite? If you ask me, my favorite were the French-made Renault ZB light tanks and the Kuomintang GMC M10 tank destroyers. But what were yours? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.